everyone, and welcome to Flying Idaho. Thanks for bearing with me while you're waiting for the next video. As you know, I was getting my flight review done and getting checked out on the Cessna 172S, and I'm happy to say that we finally got it all done. So it took 3 flights. You've seen the first one. The second one was a real short one, very time constrained because of scheduling, so I didn't get to film that one. But you didn't miss much there, just a bunch of landing practice. And this one, we take the airplane out. I just wanted to fly it around and kind of get a feel for the rudder coordination. So we did a little bit of air work, some turns, climbs and descents. In this section during the climb out, we're working on the autopilot and just familiarizing myself with how it works and how to use it. And I'll skip ahead to the parts where we're doing some landing practice. You'll notice we have a little bit of a crosswind to deal with, just a couple knots, but enough that it really makes you separate your rudder coordination from a proper crosswind crab angle, which you'll notice that I struggled with pretty bad. But in the end, my instructor felt that I was safe enough and proficient enough in the airplane, so he did sign off my flight review and also my checkout in the 172. I've been flying again since then, and that video is coming soon. Took a couple friends up for a mountain tour, just a quick flight, and flew around some Idaho mountains, so I'm sure you'd like to see that footage. Hopefully we've got some good shots in that footage. I haven't watched it all. Also working on getting some audio for cockpit audio, so that will add quite a bit to the videos, obviously, and also wanting to maybe looking to getting another GoPro so we have some other angles to choose from. But anyhow, thanks for watching as always, and I'm going to just skip ahead to the landings and maybe do a little self-criticizing on those, because that's the way we make ourselves better. So here you notice that I just reduced the power and added 10 degrees of flaps. This is the initial descent, beam the numbers of the runway. We extended this downwind out to a 45-degree angle and then start turning to the base leg, which is what you see now. One thing that I seem to typically do when I'm a little out of practice is I let that initial descent happen too rapidly. So I ended up a little lower and slower than I wanted to be on the base. You see how flat it is now. So I add some power and kind of stop the descent temporarily. Here I am turning final, kind of just flying level until I get to where I can start descending again. So here's more power and more power. And now we're rolling into the final approach, and the altitude looks about right, so the power comes back to 1500 RPM, and I think we left the flaps at 20, I believe. Since we were low, there's no need to go to full flaps, and still kind of a flat approach because I was just losing too much altitude in the beginning. But we stabilized it, and here we are coming in. Again, there's a slight crosswind from the right, so there's a little bit of right aileron pressure, and then the rudder to keep the nose wheel in line with the runway. Not a bad result for the first one, but they didn't all go that way. So trim goes back to takeoff setting, flaps retracted, full power. Probably a popular myth is that touch and goes mean that you just touch the runway and then immediately take off again. And while that's certainly possible, that's not really how a true touch and go goes. It's more akin to a rejected landing or a go-around. What is the difference? Well, a touch and go is landing practice, and it involves reconfiguring the airplane to immediately take off again, which, as you notice, there's a couple steps. The flaps have to come back up, trim has to be reset, and then you apply the power and take off again. When you're flying and just did a touch and go in the sense where you're touching the runway and taking off again, that would be pretty hard to accomplish, and you'd be flying the airplane way out of trim, which would be kind of difficult to do and a little bit dangerous too, for that matter. Now, you can certainly do that, and I have done it, but not with the intention of doing it. It's like I said, it's a go around. So you're coming down, you don't like how the landing's turning out, and you immediately add power and raise the nose to start climbing away, but you might already be descending at such a rate, or might be already close enough to the runway that you touch it anyway before you actually begin to climb away again. And here we've turned downwind again. You can see we're parallel to the runway. There's a line of buildings parallel to it as well out to the right. You'll hear that slight power reduction as we bring the power back to maintain pattern altitude, which is 1,000 feet off the ground. Now let's see how I do on landing number 2. Here we are turning final for landing number 2. You'll notice I'm a little bit higher this time, so it's a better approach profile. It looks a little steeper, you might notice. And that's what we're looking for. We want the airplane to pretty much glide down. So you do have to keep a little bit of altitude to do that. The idea is that if you have an engine problem at any time during the approach phase, that you still have enough energy to glide to the runway and make the landing even without that 1500 RPM. As you noticed at the end there, I still got a little bit lower than I should have been, and there was a slight little jar to the left because I didn't have enough crosswind correction angle in, so the wind's pushing me slightly left as the wheels touch down, and it's very noticeable. Maybe not on the camera, but you can certainly feel the plane lurch to the left. That's called side force, and it's not good for the landing gear either. These Cessna planes are very rugged and very tolerant of that, but a good coordinated landing doesn't allow for any side force. It just rolls straight on. So the idea is to get that crosswind and correction angle correct, so that the wheels are lined with the runway, not with the wind. And what that requires is a little bit more aileron to hold the upwind wing down and neutralize that drift. It's kind of hard to visualize that without being able to show you some sort of graphic or something. But if you think about it a little bit, if you ever drove a boat, I guess that's the most similar analogy. You can head the boat in one direction, and you might find that the wind or the water currents will push the boat to the left or right, and you have to steer into that current or into that wind a little bit to compensate and keep the boat heading straight. Airplanes are very much that way too. They will weather vane. They always try to point into the wind. So the airplane's nose in this case wants to go to the right because that's where the wind's coming from. But if I landed it with that angle, that means it would swerve right really drastically as soon as it touched down. Not a good situation. So how do we work around that? Well, you keep the airplane, the nose, the body of the airplane, the wheels of the airplane lined up with the runway using the rudder. But to compensate for the wind, you use the ailerons to hold the upwind wing down. So the right wing, in this case, needs to be held down a little bit, and that neutralizes that drift or the wind pushing you across the runway to the left. So if you have any side force when you touch down, it means you didn't have enough aileron in. It's funny that it's easy for me to sit here and analyze myself, but when you're actually doing it, there's so much going on that it's very hard to mentally grasp, what you need to do. It's not a natural thing because it feels uncoordinated. In other words, you might be using right aileron and left rudder, whereas your natural instinct is to use right and left, as you would normally do in coordinated flight. So it takes a little bit of time to kind of master that idea, to control the angle of the plane or the yaw of the plane separately from the bank of the plane, because they are two different things, but you get so used to using them together that it's kind of hard to use them opposite of each other. So now I've yacked us all the way around to the third landing. Let's see how I do this time. Pretty good so far. Might have been a little wide on the downwind. That seems like a really long base to final turn, but it looks like a nice approach angle. Got the airspeed stabilized, full flaps. Let's see if I got the crosswind correction this time. Notice that the nose drifted a little bit the other way, so I might have had a little bit too much right rudder in, but the plane did not drift. Now you see Darin trying to explain to me how I overcompensated. So what do? Trim to takeoff, flaps up, full power. I'm gonna go try again. I paused for that bird to get by us though. same crosswind technique also applies on taking off. In this case, with a very, very minimal crosswind, it has more of an effect on landing than takeoff. But in any case, it works the same way. You use the rudder to keep your nose lined up with the center line of the runway, and you keep the upwind wing aileron down a little bit to keep that wing from creating more lift than the other and shoving you sideways or drifting you across the runway. In the event of any significant crosswind, you would actually apply full aileron in that direction, and that would cause the airplane to lift off the ground on one wheel first, and then you reduce the bank angle until you maintain a straight track on the runway. The other wheel usually lifts off a second or two later. And you would land the same way, obviously, in a more significant crosswind. So the technique's the same, it's just a matter of how much aileron you're putting in, depending on how much crosswind you have. Now, I believe the wind was at about a 30-degree angle, about maybe 6-7 knots on this flight. So the actual crosswind that you're dealing with is somewhere around 2.5-3 knots. So in a light airplane, like I said, it makes a little bit of a difference. You can't really see it very well in the video because, one, it's being compensated for, and two, it's a very, very slight drift, but you can certainly feel it. I do have a video where I was flying the 182 in a pretty decent crosswind. I think it was 16 or 18 knots, gusting to 26 or something like that. It was a rough ride. And again, it was only 30 degrees or so off the runway, but the crosswind component of that was much higher. And so that little video clip really shows a pretty dramatic bank angle into the wind to correct for that drift. And also the one wheel upwind touched down first, followed by the other, and then the nose wheel, and required full aileron after touching down to keep the airplane from being blown to the left on the runway while we're slowing down. So you see Darin's here teaching me the importance of maintaining a nice smooth descent profile. And it's getting better, but still kind of all over the place since almost rusty. But also it's kind of getting familiar with the 172. It does fly a little differently. It's really right in between the 52 and the 82. It's not as light as the 152, obviously, but it doesn't require all the muscle that the 182 seems to require. The wing seems to be a lot more efficient, so it likes to float and float and float once you get down to ground effect. So airspeed control is very important. And how do you control your airspeed? Well, the best way is to fly a nice smooth profile so that you don't float and float and float and float like you just did there down the runway. So that happened just because I was 2 or 3 knots faster than I should have been. And those 2 or 3 knots can add up to 300, 400, 500 extra feet when you're rounding out, waiting for the airplane to decide to land. So here we are, trim set to take off, flaps up, full power, going around for number 4. one question I get asked a lot is, how often do you fly? And I guess it's because on my Instagram feed I'm always posting pictures of flying or little clips from the air. So most of my friends think that I fly all the time, and a few even think I do it for work. Well, I'll set the myth straight. I don't fly very much at all, probably on average once a month or so. Flying is a very expensive hobby. It is only a hobby for me. It is not my work. And you know what? Honestly, I thought I'd wanted to be an airline pilot or something, but I don't think it'd be as much fun if it was something I had to do for work. I kind of like just being able to go fly whenever the urge strikes and take some people with me. I love exposing new people to the world of light aircraft and general aviation, because it's a whole different experience. You get to fly low and slow and see things that you normally don't get to see when you fly on an airliner. And most people are pretty fascinated by that. It's like sitting in an armchair and just cruising around above the ground and checking everything out. It's not for everybody though, because it is a little noisier, and the plane being a little smaller, it tends to bounce around in turbulence a little more, and you feel things that you don't feel in the larger, heavier airliners. But anyway, I fly about once a month, and usually for about an hour or so, and it's about all I can afford. I'm trying to get to where I can fly every 2 weeks or so, but that's also constrained by the airplane too. Is it available, or is it down for maintenance? Currently, even though there's 3 airplanes I could fly, I'm only really current in the 172. So before I rented either of the other 2, I would have to go get a little bit of refresher training with Darin, just to make sure that I'm comfortable and remember all the airspeeds and power settings for those particular airplanes. I've flown quite a few hours in both the 152 and the 182, so I'm sure that would come back pretty rapidly. Maybe after just a 30-minute flight or so, I'd be pretty comfortable. But not something you want to do is fly an airplane that you haven't flown for a long time, unless you have somebody competent with you to make sure that you're doing it right. So that landing was a little bit better. You notice didn't float as much, better airspeed control. So tendency to drift a little bit, and again it was too much right rudder that time, or right aileron I should say, overcompensating for the little crosswind. Here we go for lap number 5. Now you'll want to pay close attention here, because Darin surprises me with a simulated engine failure on climb out. He's checking to see how well I react and what steps I take to prepare for an emergency landing. I've been taught, like most pilots, that if you have an engine failure or loss of power on the climb out, your best option is usually straight ahead, because turning and trying to land somewhere can use up valuable energy of the airplane and you may not make it. In this case, I reacted appropriately and inappropriately at the same time. I did hold the nose up and establish glide airspeed and trim the airplane to glide airspeed, but I didn't turn anywhere, and Darin's pointing out there's a nice field right down there that I could have easily made and landed, but it's just that idea of going straight ahead, which in this case would not have been a very good option. So the point being is to always pay attention to your surroundings and have a place picked out for an emergency landing. So you notice he just cut the power again, and now he has me returning to the departure end of the runway to make an emergency landing. So at this point we're about 1,000 feet off the ground, maybe about 1.5 miles from the runway, and he has me announce on the radio that we are practicing a simulated engine failure. Normally we wouldn't turn around and land opposite to the traffic, but in this case there wasn't any traffic, so we felt like we could do that safely. He was also demonstrating to me that the airplane will make the turn and will be able to glide all the way back to the runway, even on the upwind or the climb out leg. So you notice coming over the end of the runway, I'm still very, very high, probably at least 400, 500 feet. So I need to put all the flaps in and get her down, and it takes a little bit of doing, about halfway down the runway before I actually land. So I think his purpose in doing that was really to demonstrate to me that, you know, as long as you got sufficient altitude, the airplane will continue to fly, and it has actually pretty decent glide range. So you should always make an attempt to land in an appropriate spot, or make it back to the runway if you're high enough to do so. Of course, our first concern is to make a safe landing where no one gets hurt. The second concern is, of course, to protect the airplane. So if you can land it in a good spot, especially on a runway, then you avoid the risk of damaging the airplane, and you can have it fixed and back in service real quick. So that was good practice, because it helps reinforce the emergency process, where you immediately establish glide airspeed and start looking for a place to land. But it also pointed out to me that I need to be more alert and more aware of where the airplane was and how high it was and how much time that would give me to set up for a landing. So we simply just turned around, setting up for takeoff again, trims back, flaps are up, and we're putting the power back in. Notice that little post-it note there? I was fixating on the VSI so much that it was affecting my landings earlier, so he covered that up, I think after the second landing, and I did a lot better without it. It's a pretty common mistake that you will fixate on an instrument, and that will cause you to stop watching the horizon like you should be, and just means you'll be kind of all over the place instead of flying a nice smooth profile. So my landings dramatically improved after he covered that up. We'll talk a little bit about it once we get back on the ground. There we go for landing number 6. in, you notice a little bit higher, more stabilized approach. Airspeed's a little high, so it's going to result in me floating down the runway. But we're still working on getting that crosswind correction under control. But I think I finally got it right on this one. You heard those little chirps. It means the right wheel touched down just before the left one, which is exactly what we wanted it to do. And stayed aligned with the center line throughout the landing. He noticed that I have a tendency for some reason to yaw to the left when I touch down, and I think it's because I'm relaxing the right rudder pressure as the plane touches down, which causes a little bit of a yaw or swerve to the left. So I was actively fighting that tendency and trying to keep my rudder pressure consistent, and then as the nose wheel touches, of course, you release that pressure so the nose wheel lines up straight and rolls straight. One of the scariest things is when you got rudder pressure in and the nose wheel touches, all of a sudden the plane will swerve in one direction as the nose wheel comes down, which is not a good thing, because you can do what's called a ground loop if you're not careful. So you have to really watch that rudder. Of course, as long as that nose is still in the air, you're still flying the airplane, and so that rudder needs to stay in there to compensate for the wind, or I should say to maintain your cross-controlled inputs to keep aligned with the runway. But you also have to remember that that wheel is also pointing in whichever direction you're applying that rudder. So just a little timing thing that just takes some experience to get used to. So here we go, setting up for landing 7. Number 7, a little wide on the final turn, coming in at a little bit of an angle. Slow and low, added a little bit of power, but again, we were really focusing on the crosswind input here. again. Right wheel, left wheel, nose, and notice no swerve this time. Finally got it right. So we pull back on the elevator, apply brakes, and retract the flaps to get maximum braking performance. So we don't have to taxi any farther than Juliet, which is our taxiway that takes us straight home. I did pass it slightly, but not bad enough that we couldn't make the turn. So that's the essence of how you get checked out in an airplane. It may take a couple of flights depending on your skill level. The first one involved all the air work, stalls, slow flight, emergency descents, and the reason is every airplane, that's the best way to get the feel for them. Followed by some out cruising stuff to learn the functions of the autopilot and the navigation equipment. This airplane has a KLM 94, which is a IFR certified GPS that drives a really nice moving map, and it's very nice because you always know where you are relative to the airports and the terrain, and so it makes it much easier to navigate. And then landing practice until you get comfortable with how the airplane handles in ground effect and in the flare and the feel. Every airplane feels a little different, so you need to get a feel for landing it.
Okay, you can have your BSI back now.
Why, thanks.
You may not have been consciously using it, but I think you were subconsciously using it.
Did I improve after you covered it?
Yes. You stopped chasing the pitch much. You stabilized much better.
Just start flying visually like I'm supposed to.
More, yeah. I mean, you still want to cross-check stuff. Cross-check the ball, make sure it's centered, on climb out.
I think it's easier, actually, just for airspeed and altimeter instead of...
Right. You bet. Set that pitch, and then am I climbing at the right speed? Am I coordinated? If not, make the adjustment. After making the adjustment on the ball, transfer that to your sight picture outside.
Right.
How am I again on that sight picture? And then hold that sight picture steady 4 or 5 seconds, then look in and check the ball again. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Watch for that ground track as you're tracking out on that center line. Pick a point as you're tracking towards it. And if you feel the drift, don't just push rudder to fix that, right?
Just
adjust
move
the
over.
heading, set your crab, change heading, to stay coordinated.
Right.
So separate coordination from crab, because they're different. You know what I'm saying? Keeping that rudder for offsetting P factor and overcoming keeping it coordinated. Versus, I need to change heading to compensate for this 19 knot right crosswind that's trying to shove me off to the runway.
Right. Gotta do this.
So when it's a real subtle wind like we got out there today, it's a little more difficult to see that differentiate between the drift and the yaw,
Yep.
And so make sure you get that
I
set.
just had to remember that those last couple will just give it just a little bit of right aileron and
So you don't drift.
keep it,
and then
keep it going, tracking down.
Roger, roger.
So everyone, thank you very much for bearing with me, and stay tuned. There are at least 2 more flights in this airplane that I have footage for that need to be edited and added, and hopefully I'll get around to that soon and won't keep you waiting as long for the next video. So stay safe, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching Flying Idaho.